You hear about a role as a CEO,
I do.
and what's your first thought? Yes, I'm ready. Let's go for it. I am ambitious, no matter what the tests say. Or do you feel like, oh, am I ready?
I said, well, what if they laugh? And that,
What if they laugh
yeah,
at you for applying for the
Yeah.
role?
like I say that now and I laugh at myself a little bit. I was not particularly connected into the mainframe. At an MD level, you are one step below being connected into that on a regular basis. So I decided to put myself forward. So I sent an email and said I'd like to throw my hat in the ring. Turns out that had I not done it that night, they were closing it the next day.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So
Cue the dramatic
just
music.
got in.
Answer this question. What will you do as CEO of Dentsu X?
Oh, that's a big question.
It's a huge
Considering
question.
you've never been a CEO before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just decided I would.
Do you Google it?
No, I didn't.
How do you be a...
I just said, you know what, I'm going to present my 90-day plan. And actually that made it a 100-day plan.
How did you know to do that? Did you
I
read it
have
in a book?
No idea.
Was it something that you'd done perhaps
No.
before, ever?
No, I needed something to organize my thinking. Hi, I'm Beth Freedman, and this is how I became the CEO of Dentsu X.
This guest's story starts over in the 50 states. In the state of Pennsylvania, she spent her earliest days. Being a part of a marching band taught her the importance of teamwork. She found her voice as the head girl of an American football team, enabling her to show others how to make the dream work. Moving into media, working with still and moving images, learning lessons along the way, confirming to her that what we do is a privilege. With her dog companion Rosie, and at the heights of her career, who's to guess what could be next? We're here with Beth Freedman, CEO of Dentsu X.
Wow, what a privilege to have you write a poem for me. That was lovely.
You're very welcome.
So, tell us, Pittsford, Pennsylvania, this is where it all begins.
This is where it all begins.
Set the scene for us. What is Beth's life like that you enter into?
So, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My dad was a salesman, traveled first by car to his territories. And then as it got later, we used to take him to the airport and drop him off. I have an older brother. He's 4 years older than me. I would like to think I was a lovely little sister, but I have a feeling I was not the best little sister. Really good, nice family home. My mom's a nurse. And so on and off during our childhood, she was working. My earliest memory of her, she was a nurse, a hospital floor nurse back in the day where you still wore the white uniform and the hat,
Wow.
which I really enjoyed
Mm-hmm.
co-opting. And so she would sometimes work night shifts. And so the bag would be hanging on the door and we'd have to wait until she woke up. And as a 5-year-old, I think I probably was, that was a really long time to wait for her to get up. And I just remember sort of sitting by the door. But really, really good place to grow up. Tight-knit community, knew all the same people from when I was in my earliest school years all the way till when we moved when I was about 12.
So was it difficult, with your dad? Your dad was away a lot, working on the road. Was that strange not to have him, or was it just normal?
It was very normal. It was back in the day, so no cell phones or mobile phones, which meant that every night around 7 we expected a call from his hotel.
So you'd all be sat around the phone waiting for dad to call.
We'd definitely be home. It meant that if something had happened that day, it wasn't till that day that we got to tell him about it. Interestingly, I think probably in some sense gave me my first exposure to a real independent woman in terms of my mom ran the house. My mom fixed things when they broke, or at least tried. She was sort of the go-to in that regard. So that was something I was really used to, and it never seemed strange for me to do that too. And it was just a needs must. It was no other reason. And when dad was home, it was great. Dad was home, and we just had another voice, a very loud voice at the table and around, and always came home with interesting stories, and always, it was a real road warrior.
Tell us about your auntie. What did you witness of her growing up, and how did she shape you?
Well, I had a few, but one of my aunts was a very, very successful professional woman, not in the world of like an office building, but she was really, really very dedicated in the world of sort of social work. And she just made her career helping people. She created community outreach programs. She, created helplines that people called into. And when I was 13, I went and stayed with her for a few weeks in the summer, and she had me come to work with her every day and start answering phones. And
how was that? 13-year-old answering phones. Were you nervous?
It was great until I definitely directed a few to the wrong place. And people were calling for help. And this was back in the, connect them with the buttons and everything. But it was so brilliant to see her. And looking back, I have so much more awareness and perspective for it. But even then, it was cool. It was cool to see the people work for her and the respect they had for her. It gave me such admiration for her. She was a working mom. She was a pillar in the community. And she just really was inspirational for me.
Fantastic.
Do you feel that helped you see a model of a kind of successful business type woman that you could aspire to be?
Back then, I don't know that I had any sense of what I was going to end up being. But it definitely broadened my awareness of what the working world looked like. But my dad's office was it was sort of my set for what I thought the working world looked like. But, when you're about 12 or 13 years old, you're nowhere near thinking, what am I going to do? Well, maybe more ambitious folk are, but I don't think I was looking too far at that point. I do always come back to it because it reminds me just about the hard work, the fact that it would have been harder being a woman in that time. She used to have to go to the Chamber of Commerce or different places and make appeals and to get yourself heard and get yourself listened to. It's all about voice, right? It's all about earning respect. She never talked about the difficulty of it ever, but I have to imagine it was. It gives me a lot of gratitude for the fact that I think it's not as hard now. But yeah, it really cemented her as a different type of person than maybe I had gotten to know in terms of the women in my life.
So you're 12 years old. You got your friends, life's going good in Pennsylvania. Then mum and dad say, we're moving.
Yeah.
Where did you move to, and how did that impact you and your brother?
So we moved to Virginia so my dad could move into the home office of his company and stop traveling so much. So on the one hand, there was a real good reason for us to do it. And interestingly, for me at that point in my life, not that I had this perspective as a kid, but it played out very sort of openly during that. Having grown up with the same group of kids, and you just getting into, so in the US, it was 6th grade. So the year, or 5th grade going into 6th grade. So your last year before you go into junior high school. And it was just a really interesting time. Everybody was starting to change out of their little kid thing and into their sort of teenagery thing. And cliques were starting to form. And friends who had been friends for a long time were all starting to sort of, the groups were starting to shift. And I had a real discomfort with that because I wasn't quite sure where I fit in. But it hadn't completely played out yet. But the good thing about moving at that time for me was it was actually the perfect time because it took me out of that and moved me into a place where I was new. And you just sort of redefined yourself into the group that you fit into in the new school. It was harder for my brother. He was a sophomore in high school, and that's a difficult time to be dropped into a new place.
What is that? Do you know what that means in English terms, UK terms?
So it's your second. So it would be year 10.
Year 10.
I think year 10.
Okay. Yeah.
So it was definitely, we had very different experiences of that. I think it was almost a relief for me, whereas it was much more challenging for him.
So you're living the American dream in this new Virginia, and you're swimming, softball, you're into a lot of sports.
Yeah.
Playing the flute.
Yeah,
playing
that
the
too.
flute, musical. Did you bring a flute today?
No.
Oh, next time, coming soon.
Yeah, no.
No.
That's about as likely as me playing softball these days.
And you, that would be fun. You'd have to teach us. But you apply to University of Virginia, you get in, and you get your first, is it your first job when you get there? Is this the first job you've had?
No, I mean, when I was in high school, I worked in a restaurant. Ironically, when I went to university, I wasn't looking necessarily for a job, but I stumbled into one, which was working with our American football team. to call it here.
Right. Which the teams in America at university are huge. I mean, how many fans would come out to see them on a...
So our stadium, I
game?
think, sat about 65,000. Oh,
At a
anybody from UVA
university?
watches this and I get that wrong.
Wow.
But I mean, Michigan University has a stadium that seats 100,000 people.
That is amazing.
It's epic. It's an
And just-
unbelievable experience to stand at the bottom of that stadium, look up and see 100,000 people looking at you like you're the enemy.
That's quite amazing. So getting involved and getting a job in this team is no small feat.
I mean, and like a lot of things in my life, it was sort of an accident that turned into incredibly meaningful and awesome and life-forming experience.
So what did you do? What was your job?
I love the English version of my job, which was head girl, but I was I was an equipment manager. And what that job meant is I was at every practice. We were running drills with the coaches. We each worked with a coach. Started out working with the linebackers. Then I worked with the running backs. And my last year of school, I worked as the head manager. So I worked with the head coach. So I ran practice, which means I ran the time and had an air horn. I was everybody's favorite.
So you ran practice. What does that mean? You're running the schedule of the whole
So I ran
practice.
the schedule. They dictated the schedule and I just ran it.
So you got how many 200-pound big American football players are you
About 100.
managing? 100.
Yeah.
And you're 18, 19?
I would have been 21 at the time. But yeah,
21.
I mean, from when I started, 19, 20, and 21.
And how did the team do?
We did all right. So my second year of working with the team, I did 3 years. We won what's called the ACC championship. So
On a championship.
yeah,
Great.
so I have a championship ring.
Look at that. We should have asked you to bring that in.
Oh, that would have been awesome.
It's
That's cool.
it's very cool, and it was a really interesting season. We have unfortunately tend to be the kind of team that can snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. That's what we're known for.
Okay.
But it was brilliant for a million reasons, right? It's great. I mean, win or lose, like both. The experience of being part of something like that, of caring so much about that, of feeling intimately, involved in it. It also just gave me a huge appreciation for the game. I didn't know very much about it at all. And the craft that goes into it and the structure, it's not, dissimilar to the kind of thinking and planning that I have to bring into the business life too.
What did you take from that you've been able to implement into your career, the way you see things, the way you approach situations?
So there's a lot. I mean, the thing for me that what you don't realize about when you watch, and I think this is any sport, but when you watch an American football game, you don't realize that every play has been mapped out. And it's been mapped out after weeks of watching the opponent's game tape. And basically you design coverage for every offense they have, and you design coverage for every defense they have. And those plays go into the game. And then by the half, you've realized they've changed all their stuff based on what they've seen of your game tape. So all of those plans basically get adjusted. And in the second half, you're bringing in new versions. And I think what it taught me was how much preparation you need to go in and how quickly you need to be able to flex. Right. Those are, and it was amazing to watch. I had no idea. There's coaches that sit up in the box, mapping everything, calling things down to the coaches on the sideline. Part of my job was to wear, for my last year, the head coach didn't like to wear his headset. Now his headset flipped between two channels, and it was the offense coaches and the defense coaches. So my job was to have that on and be listening to the coaches and then tell him the things he needed to know. So it was just an absolute education. It was also really funny because they would forget I was listening and say some really wildly hilarious stuff. And then I'd have to pipe in and say, oh, George wants to know this. And, oh, Beth, forgot you were listening. Sorry. But so, certainly from a standpoint of what it takes to be successful. But I will tell you that without question, the thing that experience did for me was teach me about finding my voice. Getting 100 college-age men, no matter how big they are, and some of them were much smaller and some of them were much larger, but they were 100 of them at any given time to shut up and listen to you takes a lot, or it could take a lot. For me, it was the combination of volume, vocabulary, and respect. And that has been from then and continued to serve me. And it was about, look, if you can get that group of people to shut up and listen to you, Part of it is because they know you have something valuable to say. And I think that's the most important thing when anybody's trying to get their voice, is make sure that what you say has value to the people you're trying to speak to. Know what you have to do to get them to listen. I'm a very effective user of swear words because of that time in my life, but I'm being very good today and I'm not going to use them. But it was probably the best training for a world like I work in that I didn't even know I was getting.
It's intimidating for most people. 100 young men, university, probably average weight is about 200 pounds maybe at this age, 15 stone, perfect training for what we enter now into, which is your pathway to become CEO. It all begins after university. You get your first job in advertising, is that right? How did that even come about? Were you like, okay, let's go advertising?
No. I was like, let's go employment. I didn't have a degree that was very specific. In fact, it was incredibly difficult to try to explain to anyone in a job interview because it was called political and social thought, which typically engendered the following response. Oh, so you thought in college.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. But I loved it. I didn't know what I wanted to study. My brother had I think an accountancy degree. Like he went into the business school. He was very clear what he wanted to do. And I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And this program basically allowed you to, you applied to get in. And if you got in, you spent your third year of school being exposed to great thinkers across the entire spectrum. So anything from psychology to history to government to philosophy, you name it, literature. And the idea was that if you get exposed to all kinds of great thinking, it helps you then to develop sort of your way of thinking, your style of problem solving or really looking at the world. And in your fourth year, you basically wrote a major thesis on the topic of your choice. So that's the part that really appealed to me. Topic of your choice. Okay. Well, I decided what I wanted to write on was the history and evolution of women in athletics.
What made you choose that?
I think, one, my experience with the American football team, so in a bastion of male dominance, to be a woman in that and to have the insider sort of experience that I did really made it interesting for me. Frankly, when I proposed it as a potential thesis topic, I also knew it would stand out because most of the people that went into this program were incredibly smart and like they're off running like countries and things now, but they were going to write about economics.
Running countries.
They're not running countries, but they're probably running parts of the US maybe.
Amazing.
But, they were economists and people who, were going to write on really serious and quite erudite topics. That wasn't interesting to me. Like those things weren't interesting to me, but this was because there was sociology in it, which I loved. Mm-hmm. There was sport, which I also loved. And it was such an epic time because it was the 1996 Olympics was such a critical time for women's athletics. And it was a really interesting time in the world in general around people starting to think, oh, wait, we could be professional athletes. This could be the women's football team, women's softball. The gymnastics was always strong, but all of a sudden it was sports, especially with football, that people were thinking, oh, it's actually exciting to watch women play. Mm-hmm. And so all of that sort of played into it just being really interesting. And that's what I wrote on. And really interesting at the end of as I was handing it in, Sports Illustrated decided to launch Sports Illustrated for Women, which really made me angry because if sports are sports, if it's women's sports interesting, put it in Sports Illustrated.
Yeah.
And the woman on the cover of it was a woman by the name of Cheryl Swoops, and she was a WNBA player. Sorry, that was the other sport that really, had an epic showing at the Olympics. She could dunk. She was unbelievable three-point shooter. Like she was brilliant. And the cover of the inaugural issue was her sitting holding a basketball, her pregnant belly with a big diamond ring on her on the front of a magazine that's about sport with one of the best sportswomen in the world. And you just go, what is this? So
what did you think when you saw that?
I was really annoyed by it. So I think there's an epilogue in my thesis around it because it just sort of did exactly the thing that the whole point of the thesis was around, which is the people who create the narrative are the people who control the narrative. And so if, I would like to hope that a woman didn't make the decision to put that picture on the front, because that's not what's going to appeal to someone who's a sports fan. This is not People magazine, which is about your life and your, outside of sport. This is Sports Illustrated. This is Action Shots. This is America's Bible for sport at the time. Ironically, the first job I got was in media, and I had a meeting with Sports Illustrated, and I totally gave it to them.
Did you?
Oh, what did you say?
I just said, I really think that was the most, I don't agree with the decision. And he asked to read my thesis, and I was like, oh, Jesus, it's full of typos. I don't know about that. But it was actually
what
somebody.
Was his position? Who you were telling?
He was the national sales director. And actually, we became really friendly. But I was some 22-year-old loudmouth who had a big opinion about these things. But I guess
do you think that experience with being involved with the football team just broke down those barriers of holding back and being too shy to say something and just saying it how it is?
I don't think so. I think what happened is my boss probably prompted them to say, oh, Beth wrote a thesis on this. And then I just probably said it. Because I will say that one thing I am still very hyper aware of is about being really is polite and finding my moments. And I think it's an interesting part of this, because one thing about voices, you got to know when to use it and how to use it. And I've probably always, to some extent, erred too much in some cases of not, not always being comfortable to make my opinion known. That's changed over time. But back then I definitely would have felt shy about it. But I know that we had the conversation, and I think it was probably really amusing for him, but I appreciated that he listened to me. And all of that to say, I'm coming out of school with a 80-page thesis on women in sport with absolutely zero practical job experience, because football meant that I had to be back at school in the middle of summer every year.
See, you couldn't go and get work experience.
So I was a temp. I was,
You started off as a temp?
I was a temp during the summers. So when I tried to start looking for a job, the number one qualification had to be that it had required no experience. And I basically picked a corridor of the U.S., so from Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., and started looking for jobs basically in the time I wasn't writing my thesis before it had to go. So Yahoo Jobs was the job board of the day. Mm-hmm. And I found a listing for an agency called Griffin Bacall. It said assistant media planner. Mm-hmm. And it said, no experience necessary. And I had no idea what that meant. But I'd done some media relations via, the sports department. So I thought it's probably something like that. So I faxed them my resume, because that's how we did things back then. And they got a call and said, we'd love to meet you. We don't fly people up for interviews, but if you can be here on this date at this time. And my dad and I took a road trip, and I went and had my interview at Griffin Bacall at 5:30 on a weekday night, and got offered the job, and apparently missed out on the math test that most people had to take for that job, because when I started, there was a class of us who started, and they're like, how'd you do on the math test? What math? What math
was
test?
Maths your strong point?
No.
Or not? So if you'd
my
taken that test,
whole career path would have been wrong, completely taken.
You wouldn't have got that job.
No way. I also did not I'd never used Excel. I'd never used PowerPoint. But I wasn't asked if I'd used any of those.
Great.
There you go.
And you know what? It was brilliant. And I worked, first of many very amazing bosses that I worked for, who taught me so much by example. I mean, I spent so much time just sitting and watching her do the job. And it's the thing I probably lament the most about our current day and age, is how little we are able to teach by just being around each other. And it's not just COVID. It's clients who don't want to pay for extra people to come to meetings. Me sitting in a meeting watching my boss in action is critical to how I understand how to handle things. So lots of that's been missing, but I had the benefit of that. And Griffin Bacall had a really cool set of clients. I worked on Hasbro toys, so I did Tonka trucks and G.I. Joe and Transformers and Jurassic Park.
What did you do for G.I. Joe?
So we did the media planning. Now back then, internet early stages, if you're planning for kids 2 to 11, you are buying television. And
what does that mean for people? What does buying television mean? You're not buying TV sets, that's for sure.
No,
you're
we're buying television commercial airtime. So, and our targets were mostly kids. Sometimes we spoke to the moms who would buy the toys. But the nag factor is real. Target the kid, they'll ask for the toy.
I've experienced that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nickelodeon and stuff. They just get hit with all the toys.
I mean, the car manufacturers have even figured that out. But I will say this. So G.I. Joe at the time, they decided to turn him into a collectible. And so he was actually targeting adults. So we did a lot of print media for that, but some really I was on some really questionable comp lists. A comp list just means the magazine that you're buying from puts you on their free subscription list. Well, I was on Guns and Ammo and like some kind of fishing and hunting magazine, like things that just are not in any way, shape, or form what I would choose to be, but we were obviously considering them. Playboy.
Mm-hmm. So you thought you'd escaped this male-dominated world.
Yeah, no, and then G.I. Joe.
And then G.I. Joe came along.
But it was great. And you said the thing about privilege, but if I start my career by sitting in meetings talking about Velociraptor Rex, what? That's not a real job. But it was a brilliant job.
So next we hit around 1999,
okay,
where you become associate media director.
Yeah.
Isn't that quite a big position for where you're at in your career?
Yeah. If you have goals and ambitions within your personal life, career, or business, and would like to overcome the challenges that you face, inspire people, and get to your goals faster, then a coach might be the right solution for you. Go to weunify.co.uk/coach. Now back to the show.
So from 97 to 99, I basically went assistant media planner, moved jobs over to Bacall, was a media planner, senior media planner, and then associate media director, I think. But, when I talk about meritocracy, I was really lucky back then because that was a world where, like, when you earned, it just felt like it was available when it was time. And I do feel like I was lucky. I was put into good positions to evolve. I had amazing managers who never saw my progression as anything but a good thing for them. And what
were you doing to progress in your career at that time? What do you think were the key things that allowed you to, within 6 years, go from entry level, no experience to associate media director?
Well, I think nothing was too small. I remember the first time I got a lot of praise from the guy who was my boss's boss. Basically, I had some time and I didn't know what to do. So I went and back in the day, all the different magazines and media owners would send you media kits, and it basically was all their information, their circulation information, whatever, big folders full of printouts. And I reorganized the media kit library, which was basically 3 filing cabinets. It was not by any means some epic achievement. It was just like it needed to be done, make things easier, gave me something to do. And he was so appreciative of it. And what I realized from that was just the fact that, there is no work you are above. Like I used to have to do all the photocopying to make these decks before we would go to our monthly meeting with Hasbro. I often didn't go to those meetings, but I'm in there, putting them together, collating them, late at night. But I was reading them while I was doing it. And so on one side you could go, well, why should I be like the group assistant doing this? On the other side, I'm like, well, if I do this, then I'm reading it, I'm learning it. I think you just have to prove that you're trustworthy. You prove that you're going to deliver on what you say you're going to deliver. You own up to the things you don't know, all of those things. But it gives people a reason to trust you and give you a chance.
Great advice. How did you get your next role?
My next role actually was me deciding I didn't want to live in New York anymore, I believe.
Oh.
Why?
So I was in New York for 6 years. And
what age are you at this point?
I am almost 30, like getting there. It was post 9/11. 9/11 had nothing to do with me wanting to leave New York. In fact,
so you were in New York for 9/11.
I was.
What do you remember about that day?
I remember everything about that day.
Where were you?
I lived on 17th Street between 8th and 9th, so which is Chelsea, which is 3 blocks above 14th Street,我where they cut the city off. Still like a mile away from the site. I had to cross 6th Avenue to go into the office, and had I looked to the right down the street when I did that, I would have seen the first tower on fire, but I didn't. I actually never noticed it.
Really? So you're walking on the street, it's on fire.
The first plane had just hit.
And you didn't see or hear it?
I was in a taxi because I was late. So I might have taken a taxi for the 10-minute walk I had. Right. But what I remember very specifically about that is if you're ever in New York or you're from New York, you will know that there is a radio station that all yellow taxis used to play, which is called 1010 Wins. It's a 30-minute news loop. And 1010 Wins, was telling the news and it hadn't hit that yet. So I'm in a taxi, don't hear it. And I get into the lobby of my building, which was not anyone from New York will know it because now it's a Home Depot on 23rd Street, but it used to be part of the International Toy Building. And it's only 6 floors. So it wasn't high enough that if you'd looked out the window, you could see because there were taller buildings between it and downtown. But I was next to a FedEx guy waiting for the elevator. And he said, "Did you hear a plane hit the World Trade Center?" I said, "Oh, no." And both of us sort of assumed it was like a small tourist craft or something. I mean, that is what all of us thought. My boss is the media director and so had a television in our office. And I was one of the first people in. So I just went in and turned on the TV. And it was, the Today Show, the NBC Today Show, they had just picked it up and it was in the background of the 2 commentators. And I just, basically that's where we were that whole day, is watching it there. And
wow.
It was,
So
it was,
the day just stops there.
I mean, at that point you don't know. And I remember, for me, what I remember about it, I mean, there's a million things I remember, but I picked up the phone in the office, called my dad. My dad was retired and is a massive news hound. I mean, the man also doesn't sleep. So he's like on the internet at 5 a.m. constantly, like news on in the background. And I said, "Dad, do you see what's going on?" And it's the only time in my life I've ever scooped him. He hadn't turned the television on. He hadn't been on his computer. And so we watched the TV across the phone line for a minute. And I said, "Well, I'm all right." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "All right, I'll call you later." And then, the second plane hit and all the phones went out. It was such a blessing because I'd spoken to him and he knew I was fine. And so everyone started calling him to know. But it made you so great. I've never seen community like I saw after that. Or I hadn't in New York. I'd never experienced it until then. I was very proud to be there and I was very proud to be a part of that community. So it wasn't that I didn't want to stay because of that. In fact, I kind of didn't want to leave because of that. But I was getting into my late 20s and I was like, I'd like to own a place someday. I'd like to raise a family. I don't want to commute 3 hours each way a day. And the affordability of living in Manhattan was very clearly never going to be there. And it was just one of those moments where you went, okay, maybe I need to go find a job somewhere else. Maybe I need to do something else. And I took a job, the only job really that I've taken outside of, this industry, because they hired me. That's a theme in my life. And moved down there, but it was in sales. That is when I did all the traveling, like the insane every week traveling. And I remember calling my dad and being like, "This is BS.
This is what you did all this time? I thought it was great. This is terrible."
Like, I had lots of miles. I never want to go anywhere ever again. Long story short, managed to make my way back into the advertising fold, which was back into media. And that's where I stayed until that role gave me the chance to move into creative.
How did the role come about? Were you like, okay, I'm not feeling this sales thing. Let me go back to...
So it was a bit of a journey. I found a small, tiny startup had been written about in the Washington Post. There was an ad agency and my friend saw it and said, "You should see if they need a media director." And I did, and they hired me. Not too long after being there, I had probably one of the first moments in my career where there was a real tough decision to make. But I realized that there was some shady stuff happening. And I came across it and realized that sort of invoices and contracts were not lining up. And when I called it out, it was like, well, no, it's just got to be like that.
But how did you call it out? Were you nervous to say something?
I was terrified.
Who did you speak to?
To the man who ran the place. And
so the CEO?
Yeah. And I just said...
So you sit the CEO down and you go...
"We're charging commission," and we said we wouldn't. And now I understand how you're able to pay for my role, but technically we're taking money we shouldn't be taking. And
what did he say?
He just said, "We can't change those things right now." And I said, "Well, I can't. My name's on those invoices." So I resigned.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you there and then go, "Well, I'm off," or you think about it?
I left that meeting and then, I spoke to my parents, frankly. I was like, "I'm not sure what's going to happen. I don't have a job."
And what did they say?
You got to do what you got to do. And So I resigned, and I had met someone through that job that we had been talking about, different things we might be able to do. And we ended up going and taking sort of a freelance opportunity to launch a magazine. So we did
You
that.
launched a magazine?
It's a magazine, okay.
What was it called?
It was called Washington Spaces, and it was a home design magazine published by the Washington Post. And for me, it was interesting because I'd always been the buyer of magazine space. I'd never been the seller. And I'd certainly never been the creator. And so that was probably about 6 to 8 months of a project to get it launched. And when we launched it, I sat down with the man who ran the publishing part of the business, and he said, "Look, the thing is that in this business, you're either on the editorial side or you're on the publishing side. So you're either selling or you're writing or designing and doing whatever."
Yeah.
And I said to him, I don't want to sell, and I don't have the right skill sets for the other bit. What I loved was, getting us to this point. And I was very lucky that at that time I came across an opportunity that hadn't existed 2 years ago with a very well-known media agency, it was MPG, Media Planning Group, in that area. And I applied for it and got it.
And to explain for people who don't know, the creative agencies or the creative people within an agency, they make the advert, they might make the TV advert. Yep. The media people go, okay, we're going to put it at 7:00 after X Factor on a Friday, and choose where the ads are going to be. Or
so it's that. I mean, when I had to explain to my parents what I did for a living at the beginning, it was really difficult because they're like, "Oh, you make commercial," and I was like, "No, but I'm the reason you see the commercial." Mm-hmm. So we buy the airtime, we pick the places it should go. But yeah, so I went from being the person who told them where to put the ads to creating the ads or leading the team that created the ads. And the most brilliant part of that transition is that I had to go from being somewhat of an expert in something, because I'd done my job for a long time. I was the media director of that office, to absolutely being in a position where I was not an expert in anything. And there is this moment in your career where you have to have comfort with the humility to say, I don't know. And it's really easy when you usually know to just say, yeah, or answer something, even if you're not sure you have the right answer, because it's really uncomfortable to be in a meeting and admit that. And for me, this immediately taught me, you forced me to be able to say, well, you know what, I don't know the answer, but I will get it for you, which is like the single best tool any of us should have, because it's okay not to know the answer. And in fact, in my job, I got lots of people who do know the answer, and my job is to make room for them to come and share that answer, or to go and ask them for it. But I went on a TV shoot 6 months into that job. I'd never been on a TV shoot. I didn't know anything about production. And I remember sitting down with the producer, and he was a really experienced producer, a real grown up, and I think was probably slightly annoyed that I was going to be the one client person on the ground with him. And I just said, look, I promise you this, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, but I will never ask them twice. You teach it to me, and it will be in there. And that was our deal.
And did he respect that?
By the end, he did. I think, it's always good words, but you have to show it. And there were times, and I said, if I'm doing something wrong, you tell me. If you want me to do something else, tell me. I can't claim to know what I'm supposed to be doing. And he wasn't afraid to do that. But he also taught me so much. And I loved it. And I spent the better part of a decade in it, I think. What it did eventually do was get me here, which was a dream of mine. And after that,
you mean London?
London was a dream for me.
From when? When was London a dream?
From that first shoot, actually, because our crew and our director and our producer were all English. We had done. They did all the post-production over in London, and I did not get to go to that. But later, with that same client, that was the islands of the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. We did an international meeting here in London. It was the first time I'd ever come, and I was well and truly in love with it from that moment on. And years later, when I was working at Fallon in Minneapolis, I got the chance to come over and help Fallon London with a pitch and sort of plant the seed that, I'd really like to come here. And a year later, I got to come here. But I had one really tough experience at one point in my career.
Are you an agency or brand that would like to work with our production company, Unity and Motion? If so, contact us at unityinmotion.com. We produce commercials and social content for brands such as Chanel, Amazon, Reebok, Harrods, The Ritz, and many more. Now back to the show.
Well, I was still in media before I moved into creative. And what was even tougher about it was that it was an experience you'd expect in a world where, you know, if you were a woman in a world defined by men, but actually what it was a lesson for me in that sometimes women can be a harder barrier for women. And it was, you know, a situation where I had come into a leadership role and there were two women who I worked with. They did not work. Well, one of them worked for me, but the other one worked with me. But both of them, so at this time I was probably just about 30. Very, you know, again, could be seen to be young in the role, but, you know, but probably only with the perspective that they had, which was we're both in their 50s. And I think, you know, well, I know that part of the tension that existed that I didn't realize existed was around the idea that it was a lot harder to come up in the time that they did, and a bit of frustration that somehow it seemed as though I'd gotten there easier and sooner. And I didn't realize this for a while. I just kept feeling like I was not necessarily, like that I was running into situations where I would assume we were going in as a team, and then it would sort of feel like, nope, actually, we're not all on the same page. I was a bit naive because I'd been very lucky. And I don't say that in any way. It's not self-deprecating. I just was. I'd never experienced it before. And both of these women were really accomplished professional women. But there was a real bias there around that sort of sense of it just wasn't as hard for you. And I think the interesting thing is you have a choice in that situation. You can either decide that it's brilliant that it's not as hard for the next generation because, geez, it shouldn't have been that hard to begin with. Or you can, whether you are conscious of it or not, decide to make it harder for them because you're just sort of annoyed that it seems easy. Now, one, that's really small thinking, I think, because you have no idea what someone's life's been like or not, and you should never assume. But two, why would we ever want to make it any harder for anyone? And I think, you know, but it was I was so stunned by it as it started to become very clear that that's what was happening. I really just kept thinking it must be something else. I must have had the wrong answer. I must have misunderstood this. And I finally got that clarity. And it was my first real disappointment in some sense. Like, you know, I'm not someone who typically I don't get that angry. I just, again, wasted emotion. I do get soul crushingly disappointed sometimes. And that was a really hard one for me, but it was a turning point because you go, okay, if there's one thing I won't do, I will never do that. I don't want to ever be that person. There's lots of lessons you learn. Lots of them are great. And some of them, you know, I want to do that. I want to be like you. And there are some that are like, I don't ever want to be like that. And that was my first, I don't want to be like that. But it was an important one.
So you then transition to Fallon.
Yes.
How does that opportunity come about? And it's another group account director role.
So the Fallon opportunity came about because I'd been about 2 years in my role at Arnold, and it kind of worked on most of the big things. And I needed a change. I needed a change in my life. I needed a change. I knew career-wise that in order to sort of cement my experience on this side of the business, where I only had a couple of years, it needed to be validated, probably with a move. And so I started looking, and I was sort of open to looking. And, you know, I remember I was far into an interview process with an agency down in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. You know, I mean, I was kind of like, and Fallon called. Now, Fallon, incredibly well-known, you know, really well-known in the U.S. In the advertising industry. But it was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which sounded like a very far away, very cold place. And when they first called me, actually, it was... I had talked about being interested in working internationally because at this point I was sort of thinking, how do I get to London? And they had a role on Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank. And that's what they called me to talk about. And actually, you know, after I spoke with them, they flew me out to do the interview. And after having done some research on it and thinking about it, I remember sitting across from the agency. He was the CEO for a while. I can't remember what his role was at the time. But I said, Mike, you know I'm a girl, right? He goes, yeah. And I said, I'm also a Jew. And he goes, yeah. I was like, do you think that Abu Dhabi Commercial Bank is going to want me to run their business? And he stopped and he goes, do you know, Beth, actually, we worked with Nadav Kander, who's a very famous Israeli photographer, and we couldn't PR we couldn't PR him. We could PR the photographs. He said, I hadn't thought about that. He said, and actually, when we've gone on business trips with them, any women in the group have sort of been put off to, they've gone over here and the men have gone over here. And I said, look, man, I am not afraid to try to break some boundaries down, but I am fairly certain that I'm not going to be able to effectively lead your business if I'm not in the room. So, and he said, that's all right. I've got this great other opportunity. We need to launch a hotel called the Cosmopolitan of Las Vegas in 6 months. I was like, that sounds interesting and slightly less terrifying. And that's what I went and did. I moved there and spent 6 months commuting back and forth to Las Vegas to help create a brand platform and a campaign to launch a new luxury hotel in Las Vegas.
So you're in this role now and developing friendships with colleagues and enjoying the time there.
Yeah.
And you go through a difficult situation personally in that 2 of your colleagues are diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah.
Tell us about what happened and how did that impact you?
I mean, it's probably the seminal experience of my adult life in regards to, within 6 weeks, 2 members of my team were diagnosed with cancer, one with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and one with breast cancer. Both were under 30, so 24-year-old with breast cancer, and I think Eric was 27.
And when you say your team, were you direct manager?
So I share managed them. I worked on one piece of business with them. And it was, I think the thing you realize really quickly is I'm very clear on the fact that I do not control the world. I don't have any say in how things happen, but you become really clear on what you can control and how you can help. And with both of them, it was like, all right, well, I can't cure cancer, but I can account manage the hell out of it. Eric and I had ongoing conversations because his treatment was extensive. Carissa went through chemo, went through surgery, post-surgery treatment, but has been in recovery since, has gone on to actually leave advertising, study oncology nursing as an oncology nurse, mother of 2, after being told she wouldn't be able to.
Wow. Amazing.
Brilliant, and meaningful, and all of those things. And Eric fought valiantly for years and unfortunately didn't survive. But throughout his fight, Eric would all he wanted to talk to me about was work. He was so ambitious. He wanted to, we're going to open an agency together, Beth. We're going to, and when I moved to London, he's like, I'm going to come there. You're going to hire me. And I would have loved to have explored any of those things, obviously. But for him, I remember about 2 things he said to me. One of which was, I remember him calling me one day. He goes, that's it. I've finished the internet. Because after you have a bone marrow transplant, you can't leave your house for a couple of months because you're so immune compromised. I've seen everything, I've read everything, I don't know what else to do. But I remember I just am tired of being sick. I just want to work. I just want to do the thing that made me feel interesting and intelligent and special. And I think about that all the time because when I say I think this is a privilege, it's not just because it's hilarious to sit in a meeting and talk about Velociraptor X, or when I ran Cadbury to have meetings where you talked about the mouthfeel of chocolate. That's almost pornographic. If you're going to have a short time, you don't know what that time's going to be, and you're going to spend it working. Love what you do. Be grateful for who you work with, and if they're not the people you want to be around, then find a different place. It's not on them; it's on you. And it became really, I have a really simple mantra that was formed in that time, because a lot of times if you're really good at what you do, a lot of times you can get away with being a real jerk. But I got really clear on the fact that I'd rather do good work with great people than great work with assholes, because where I had my biggest struggles was where I was trying to be me and follow my principles in a world where no one else was being held to them, or other people weren't being held to them. And that's fair enough, because if I'm not running the company, if I'm not making the rules, I can't necessarily expect those who are to subscribe to my feeling. But I also fundamentally believe that you can find talented people who are great and who understand and don't want to, use their power in that way. So I'd just rather find those people and create that environment where great work and great humanity are equally weighted. And in a business and a life that is such a privilege and that I am thankful for every day, that has to be the core of it. And I feel like I'm paying that back to Eric every day when I do that, but I also know I'm just paying it back to myself because that's what I want. And that's what and I'm okay if that's not what everybody else wants. But the awesome part is now I get to have a say in that because I'm a CEO. It means I get to have a big say in that. Probably the best part of that job.
Love that. Thank you for sharing.
Thank
yes.
you. So you're over at Fallon now. What do you remember about your first few months in this role in London?
Oh,
How did it come up though?
So
to go to London?
Because of the work I did on the Cosmopolitan, the owner of the Mayfair Hotel had seen that work and really liked it and put his business up for pitch and went to Fallon London thinking they'd done it.
Amazing.
So they called us up and said, could you help us? And I said, yeah, and I'd be happy to come over if that would be helpful. And they took me up on it. And then the day before I was supposed to leave, the new business guy got us a meeting with the main client and said, look, I've got someone who ran the Cosmopolitan business throughout the launch and she could come talk to you if you'd like. So we got that epic non-pitch meeting that you always want to have. And at the end of it, she goes, you'll be in the pitch, right, Beth? And I was like, yeah. And then, of course, I had to stay and be in the pitch.
And you're thinking, great, I get to stay
let's
longer
win
in
it.
London.
And then they all hire me. They didn't win it. It wouldn't have been big enough to hire, bring someone over anyway. But a year later, they had basically a group account director level role, or I don't remember what the title was, but around that, available, and called me up and said, would you still be interested in moving? Yes, I would. And so I've been here since August of 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Charles and I know the Mayfair Hotel very well.
Yeah.
That's actually where we met and decided to set up our production company, Unity in Motion.
I love it. The thing about the Mayfair that I will never forget is it has a very distinct scent. So, when you walk in, there's a very
That's true.
perfumed air.
Yeah.
It's not dissimilar. There is a Vegas hotel that has the same scent. It's an air scent, but it's stayed the same for as long as I've been ever in there. It's always been the same, but it is so definitively that's the Mayfair.
I've never noticed that, but
Yeah,
now you
will
say
now.
it. Yeah,
I have now.
for sure.
But yeah, no, it was, it's very nostalgic for me because it was a big part of me getting here.
So then Saatchi comes up.
Yes.
Saatchi, we had Sam Hawkey here,
Yeah.
who's at Saatchi. You were there at a similar time.
We were.
And he was CEO at Saatchi for a bit last year.
Yeah.
How did the opportunity come up at Saatchi, and what did you think? Wow, this big agency. You're already at a big agency, Fallon, but also Saatchi has a name for itself.
So Fallon and Saatchi are sister agencies. And a lot of Saatchi at the time, their leadership had started at Fallon. So Magnus Jabba, who was the CEO when Sam and I both were at Saatchi before Sam was on his way for that. Magnus had worked at Fallon in the years where Cadbury Gorilla and Sony Balls and all of that really famous Fallon work. And then
so Fallon did the amazing advert with the gorilla and for Cadbury's, which one of the most well-known adverts of the 21st century.
They did. I was not a part of that, but it was absolutely part of its epic history. And a lot of that leadership then went over and went to Saatchi. And so when I was starting to think about what I wanted to do next, I'd run Cadbury for a couple years. There was lots of stuff happening, and an opportunity to move over to Saatchi and work on Toyota came up, and I had a chat with Magnus about it. And felt like, let's give it a shot. It proved out to be a great choice for me. And Saatchi then became another great choice for me. I was more developed in my career. I had more understanding of the market. And I was there for a while working on Toyota. And when Toyota left, it was another swerve for me because...
How was that? When did you find out news that... So Toyota goes, we don't want to do our business here. We want to go with somebody else. What's that like?
Grey Matter's new business tip for today. Keep going when the times get busy and don't take your eyes off the long-term pipeline. It's so important to keep the new business machine running. Set aside time each week to work solely on your new business efforts. If you remain proactive, you'll ensure that work never dries up. Grey Matters is a straight-talking business development consultancy that empowers agencies to position, market, and sell themselves for new business success.
Oh, I've been through it before. I think, you know what, it was interesting because I was at a level that it was enough that you start looking at it from a different perspective, which is why, how could we have saved that? Where was it? What I was really grateful for is that, the conversation immediately began about, okay, what should we do now? And as someone who was on a work-sponsored visa, that was quite comforting because you do not want to.
So you thought, because your role is just Toyota.
Yeah.
So if Toyota goes, you're thinking, might not have a job here. Then it might be back to the US.
And I was glad that conversation happened very quickly, and I was offered a role on a very big account. I was offered the opportunity to sort of step in and help run this sort of small startup B2B practice that was sitting inside of Saatchi. And again, I made the smaller choice.
Why?
Because I felt I could make a bigger impact. And
was this tactical? Like, did you have a career plan in mind this time? Like, okay, if I go here, make an impact, I can get to CEO.
It wasn't. You know what? At the time, as much of it as anything is one of the roles. So the other role was to work with the leadership on HSBC. But I would have spent a lot of time on an airplane going to Hong Kong. And at the time, I just met my husband. I was getting to know my stepdaughters. And I did not want to be on a plane all the time. That didn't sound exciting to me. What sounded exciting to me was being around. I will be the first to say I never had this grand plan to be a CEO. I never had this grand plan that I was going to do this step and this step and this step. A lot of this time of my life was around, making sure that I was still employed in the market so I didn't have to go home, but also trying not to ever be false to my own, be happy where you are. And if you're not happy, make a change. It's not always as easy when you don't have control over your destiny necessarily. But again, fair share of luck in that regard. So swerved into B2B.
Okay. So we're getting to a critical point in your career now where you're about to make the leap to become a managing director for the first time. Gyro.
Yeah. Which
is a big company. They've got offices all over the world. Do they give you a call and go, hey, Beth, we're looking for an MD. Will you come here?
So no, not exactly like that. But what happened, so my boss, who I worked with on Toyota, had left after Toyota left and went over to work at a Dentsu agency called 360i. And she was speaking with another woman from Dentsu who was telling her they were looking for this role.
And let's explain who Dentsu are. This is a company that owns lots of companies around the world.
Yes.
Generating in the 13, 15 billion pounds a year.
Dentsu is a Japanese-owned agency group. It is one of the holding companies a la IPG or Publicis Group
But one of the big four, they say. Right.
Yep. Among many brands, they own Gyro, which is now called Merkle B2B. But Gyro was a global B2B practice that they had acquired. Dentsu did a lot of acquiring, so and that was one of their big acquisitions. So this previous boss of mine heard this opportunity and called me and said, would it be okay if I gave your name? There's an MD opportunity over here at the B2B agency.
So is that how it works sometimes?
That's a lot
someone
of the time.
knows there's a job going and they've got people that have worked for them in the past and they go, can I put your name forward?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's something I feel really strongly about paying forward all the time because that, someday you're on someone's mind and that happens. And it was life-changing for me. And I, one of the things I'm proudest of is that I can think of at least 2 or 3 or 4 people whose names I put forward who had jobs and career swerves because of it. Why wouldn't you? Like, we're all doing that. But it makes it, you get an amazing sense of, why you want to be the kind of person people remember in a good way.
So is this job even advertised anywhere or it's really...
I'm sure it was. I think they'd been interviewing, but I wasn't looking.
Right. And if your name gets recommended, obviously that's going to come with some weight.
Yeah, I mean, it got me a call with the woman who was leading the sort of initial part of the hiring, very senior woman in the Dentsu business. And it meant, we had a phone call that turned into a face-to-face meeting that then put me right in front of the person who was going to be the CEO of Gyro at the time. And it was, I just, again, you look back and you think of these moments that are truly life-changing. It was a huge life changer for me.
Did you get nervous in those interviews, or how did you deal with it?
I find that as long as I feel like I'm prepared and I know what I'm talking about, like I do in a client presentation, I don't find that I'm that nervous. But I also feel like I quite quickly either have a sense that I've got good chemistry with the person I'm speaking to, or I don't. And if I don't, then I'm a little more nervous because I just know that it's not clicking. I will say the thing that was the most nerve-wracking about that was, so as part of the process, there was actually, they asked me to take so it was a combined sort of like leadership traits / aptitude type of test. Sort of the kind of thing that, gives them a sense of your strengths, your weaknesses, whatever.
Yeah.
And I remember it's one of those, like, is it more like this statement or this statement? And then the statements become closer and closer together and you go, Jesus, I don't know. And you can kind of get a sense of what it's trying to ask you. But I found that challenging because there were definitely some parts of it where there were both statements I didn't agree with, but I had to pick one. And I was like, I wonder what that's going to end up coming out like. But then the other part of it was the aptitude test. And there was a timed math test. Remember how I said I wasn't going to pass the math test?
Didn't escape this one, though.
Jesus. Percent change. And I walked in and I remember saying, look, I just need to be really clear with you. I said, I can do math, but under time pressure without a calculator. And when there's a lot on the line, I would suggest you ask anyone but me to do it. And he said, actually, you can tell by how, apparently they read the mouse clicks and stuff. It was terrifying. And he said, ooh. I can tell that if you hadn't been under time pressure, you could have answered it. And I was like, I'm glad you said that, but I'm not sure that's true, but okay. But what was interesting is they had some questions for me on the part of the test with all the statements. And she said, we're a little, there's an interesting thing that's come out, and it's that it's read that you don't have a lot of ambition.
Oh.
I went.
And here you are applying for an MD role.
Yeah.
That's not what they want to see. And I said, wow, okay. Can I ask you what questions, were associated with that? And it was turned out, so there were, a few that I'd really struggled with. And some were about the future. And I said to them, in all honesty, I'm someone who sits on a visa. So it is hard for me to think 5 years in advance because that's out of my control a little bit. So when I'm being honest in my answers, that probably comes through as not having ambition for the future, but that's just pragmatism for the fact that I'm in a unique situation. But the ones that really were attributable to ambition were written in such an egotistical and lacking humility kind of language. I could not pick them. And so when they read them, and I said, well, I would never say it that way. And he said, well, how would you say it? And so I don't remember the statement, but I said, well, I would say it this way because it's true, but it's authentic to me. And thankfully, I had the chance to explain that because at the end of that, I was offered the job. But
had the same interview?
Yeah.
There and then?
Had I not been able to have that conversation, I would have been wiped off the board.
Really?
Yeah. So it was, it was a really interesting sort of like moment to realize, wow. And actually, ironically, I've had to take that test again. Some of the language has changed significantly.
Right.
That's good.
Sure had nothing to do with me, but hopefully evolved with the time. But I was also much more, like I was just clearer on what I was being asked. So I was able to be very careful about how I chose my answers. But yeah.
There's two sides of the lesson, I think. I think from let's say an employer's side, asking questions to really define what that data is telling you, so that you can find those points that cannot be conveyed through a computer mechanism or through basic data. And also from yourselves, just to be being authentic and saying, well, this is how I would say it. Yeah. This doesn't reflect how I think or how I would act.
There's a thing we talk about a lot at Dentsu around. It's more important to understand not what people are doing, but why they're doing it. So it's about the motivation, right? And that is, when you try to do that, it forces you to ask different questions. So we have tons of information and data about what people are doing, but if we don't understand why they're doing it, then you can really read a situation wrong. And that, in reflection, I'm really glad I had that chance. And again, would have been gutted not to get that job, especially if I'd found out that was why.
Yeah. So you're now the managing director of Gyro. What were the new challenges you faced in this role?
The next thing was around finding, it's going to sound really silly, but finding my leadership voice. Not that I didn't have one, but finding mine in an environment where there were already two very strong leadership voices there. So how to find mine in a way that was complementary, but also true to me. There were definite moments where I felt I needed to sort of dial back some of me to fit in more with the sort of feeling just to fit in a bit better. And I was uncomfortable a little bit with that, but I was also aware, that you learn to turn the dials. Like the dials are my favorite thing to sort of help people understand when you talk about, like, you'll find the things that are most important to you or that define you or that your way of talking or your voice. But those dials are not static. You are often, I have to turn the swear dial down. See, I can effectively do that. But, or humor is also my go-to. I can't, for me, that's just a way of leveling the playing field. Whether I'm funny or not, it's another question. But humor tends to work to take some of the tension out of a room. But there are rooms where being funny is not in any way, shape, or form going to get you anywhere. So, my dials always have to be, slightly adjusted to make sure I'm aware of my environment. And I felt like some of them were being turned down a little bit more on the ones that were authentic to me. But I also realized that was a time thing. That was me needing to earn respect and create my place there, and then be able to find my way back to feeling like I was being me and authentic to me, but also being respectful and authentic to that entire agency. And that was really good experience in that regard. When I talk about an MD role being a great way to go from sort of specialism to more broader generality, it truly was that for me. I was, just attached at the hip to our CFO. So learning, his insight inside out from, a perspective of the commercials, working in partnership with our creatives, in partnership with the media team. And you really are, in some sense, that I would say, without question, the MD role is the most challenging role, because you are still someone that oftentimes is a client's main point of contact. You are still doing the as well as overseeing it. While, and it's that balance of, you sometimes are the solution, and sometimes you shouldn't be, but you still are, because you can be. You're still close enough into that to be able to do that. And it's, it's a ton of responsibility. It's without question, I think, the busiest role in an agency. It's certainly, and actually the transition from that role to CEO, the first thing was like, whoa, I'm not that anymore. And I'm not supposed to be. That role is someone else's role. But you go from that sort of you are touching everything all the time. Every number in this. And you have to find your way around the CEO role where you are comfortable with the fact that you still want to know all of that stuff, but it's someone's job to tell it to you as opposed to yours to divine it all the time. Yeah. And it's quite a shock to the system.
Yeah, we have heard the MD role being the one that's most challenging to most people, as opposed to the CEO role, which is a
different kind of challenge. The MD role you're ready for. You are coming from a sort of a history of being, of various levels of doing. I think about it and I think, my God, it was exhausting, except I loved it. I didn't realize that then. It's only with, sort of reflection away from it that you go, my God, that is it. I have the utmost respect for my MD, because I think, my God, I don't know if I could do it again.
So we get to you become MD in January 2018.
Yep.
2020.
Yeah.
Quite an interesting year. Whole world goes into lockdown.
Yeah.
And it's in July 2020. You hear about a role as a CEO.
I do.
And what's your first thought? Yes, I'm ready. Let's go for it. I am ambitious, no matter what the tests say. Or do you feel like, oh, am I ready?
So I read the email. So there was an internal email saying we are looking to fill this role. I knew the person who was leaving the role. We worked together. And I read it and I saved it, but I thought about it for a while. And at some point, I think I spoke to one of my closest friends in the business and said, oh, they're hiring for this role. I was thinking about maybe I should put my name forward. Of course you should. I don't know. Had a similar conversation with my husband.
What did he say?
Both he and my friend said to me, why wouldn't you do it? And I said, I said, well, what if they laugh? And
what if they laugh at you for applying for the role?
And I don't, and I like, I say that now and I laugh at myself a little bit, but I think it was exemplary. I was not particularly connected into the mainframe. I was at an MD level. You are one step below being connected into that on a regular basis. And so it does feel a bit distant.
What do you mean connected to the mainframe?
So, sorry. That's not, but if once you're at that CEO level, you are not only running your agency, but you are part of the senior leadership team across all the Dentsu brands. So you are more connected in with the sort of the main leadership of Dentsu, the holding company, as well as, so the UK CEO, all the people who sit in the center in very high leadership positions. They aren't very well connected to anyone below that CEO level on a day-to-day basis. I mean, certainly.
So that's a room you haven't really been in before.
Not much.
So you feel like, oh, who am I to apply for this role?
They're going to go, and Dentsu X was an interesting one. And one of the reasons I did feel like I should apply for it is at the time, Dentsu X was still an integrated creative and media shop. And that is ironically, it's my sweet spot. After years of trying to prove to people that I was one or the other, that actually, because I've been both, that puts you in a really rather unique category. I knew at some point it would make me marketable. That's not true, by the way. I never thought it would, but it did finally turn into being a positive. But so the sort of reaction to me when I said what if they think I'm crazy or whatever, is like, well, who cares? What's the worst they do? They say no. What does that matter? Okay. This is actually all in my head because nobody's going to think me silly for having done it. So I decided to put myself forward. So I sent an email to the two people on there and said I'd like to throw my hat in the ring. Turns out that had I not done it that night, they were closing it the next day.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So
Cue the dramatic music.
Got in.
Yeah. And I'm so glad I did it. Obviously, for a million reasons, but can
you share what the process was like? So you send me and saying, "Yeah, I'll throw my hat in the ring," and what happens next?
So they ask for your your CV, and the first thing I realized is like, I don't actually have an up-to-date CV because I wasn't looking for a job. But no, it was a really not. It wasn't an incredibly long process. My first meeting was with our chief client officer for Dentsu and then the head of HR for the UK. And they were sort of the first cutoff point. I remember getting the call from the chief client officer saying, I'm really thrilled to tell you you've made it through the next round. And it was because it was during COVID. It was a video call, so I couldn't let my jaw drop like I wanted to. But I was like, oh, that's amazing. But
are you still thinking at this point, they're not going to take me seriously? Or
at this point, what I'm thinking, so it was really interesting. That first meeting was really important in the process for me because what I decided going into it was that I wanted to be sure that I at no point, you can prepare for an interview like a test. You can study a bunch of stuff you didn't know the day before. You can learn it. You can cram it. You can go in and sound like an expert. Sometimes we're going to know that you've done that. Sometimes we're not. But it's not impossible to go in and kind of blag your way through. And what I wanted to make sure is that at no point I felt like I was doing that. So I wanted to make sure that throughout the entire thing, I knew the answers, or the answers I were giving were authentic to me, or I admitted I didn't know it. Because what I didn't want to be was getting the job on false pretenses, because I knew that would really suck. Like that I'd eventually get found out. And that first interview was really cool because at the end of it, I didn't feel like I had to blag anything. I felt happy with how I'd done, and I felt authentic. Like I felt like I'd answered authentically. And if they didn't think I was right for the job, cool. But I don't, I was proud of myself. I sort of felt like, I've done all right. And that was kind of how I wanted to feel. That I realized that's just, if I feel like that throughout this process, then cool. And if I get it, great. And if I don't, like, I was still really not thinking it was like it's a big deal. Like, that's a big title. Yeah. So I just was sort of like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna keep taking that. So so the second call was actually with the man who is my boss now. And in prep for that, what they basically had me do is it was like, answer this question: what will you do as CEO of Dentsu X?
Oh, that's a big question.
It's a huge question.
Considering you've never been massive. A CEO before.
Yeah.
So I just decided I would.
Do you Google it?
No, I didn't.
How do you
I just said, you know what, I'm going to present my 90-day plan. And actually that made it a 100-day plan, because there's, typical of the US presidency, there's always like a 100-day plan. And then, and so I was like, I'm American, I'll say it's a 100-day plan.
How did you know to do that? Did you read it in a book?
No idea.
You just decided?
It just made sense.
Okay.
Was it something that you'd done perhaps before, ever?
No, I needed something to organize my thinking. And so that's what I did. Now, ironically, when I spoke to my boss after I had the job, he said, I did the same thing. I did, or actually he told me in that interview, he goes, I wrote a 90-day plan.
Okay. You're like, good. I've made the right decision.
And then I used something.
What was his role, by the way, the person interviewing?
So he is the CEO of the media line of business at Dentsu. Okay. He was very funny. I had this whole, PowerPoint deck, and he literally, I don't think I showed him 3 slides. He just started asking me questions, and so I had a slide that said that, but it was a brilliant conversation. And again, I didn't feel like I had to make anything up. I didn't feel like he was asking me a question where I was like, the duck under the water going, crap, so much of it was about leading people. So much it was about, how do you come into an organization that we know right now is in the midst of a massive transformation, is, has had a lot of identity change. How do you, all of that. And it was stuff that I was just, it was my heartland. It was the stuff that I really believed in. It was also really important to acknowledge that I didn't have the answers, like necessarily. I was going to try things, and if they didn't work, we were going to evolve them. But post that, I met with our UK CEO, and I'd met with the global CEO of Dentsu X. But by then, I was aware I was in the sort of final consideration set. And it's funny, it switches from, I think I could do this, to I want to do this, to I really hope they give me the job.
Because by this point, you've put all this, you put a 100-day plan together, and
you believe you can do it.
Thought about getting the role for so long, yeah. What do you remember about the day? How did they let you know?
I got a call saying, we want to offer you the job, which was brilliant. And, I remember, so I was in a different part of our house to where my husband was. And I was just sort of, he knew, I'm not sure if it was a scheduled call or not. So I just was sitting there for a minute, kind of going. And then I, walked in, and it's like, they offered me the job.
Nice.
And it, it was awesome. And it continues to be. Like, I'm so proud of this job. I love this job. I love what I get to do for a living. It's awesome. But it was, it was an achievement I never really realized I wanted to have. And, any job you get should feel like that, right? This just happened to feel like that, and it has a really cool title associated with it. But it was, it's epic.
So considering you've never done this job before, you start and you're now the boss of the company, everybody's looking to you. What do you do? Again, do you Google? What do you do on your first day as CEO? How does it work? Does someone take you through and show you what to...
Amend that to, what do you do on your first day as CEO in COVID? So I couldn't meet anyone personally. So what I did ahead of start date was meet my exec team via video.
Which consists of?
So I have an MD, a chief strategy officer. At the time I had a chief data and tech person, and I had a head of new business. And so I met each of them, spoke to them, they were running the agency. So I said, tell me about it, talk to me about it. Tell me because the first part of my plan, which, and I actually used that 100-day plan, but the first thing I said I was going to do was spend 30 minutes talking to every single person in the agency. Now, this is where the benefit of your agency not having 400 people, I had about 85. So I did 85 30-minute calls, And my
40
goal was to
hours
do
almost,
that
yeah.
before 3 months was up. So I was doing about 3 or 4 a day, and meet every single person and have them talk to me about who they are, how they came to be at Dentsu X, what their experience is at Dentsu X, what are the things that are great, what are the things you want to, you hope I'm going to try to change. And my commitment to them was after I did that, I was going to share back with them what I learned. And so I put a presentation together, which I took the exec through first, and their thoughts were in there as well. The calls I did with them had figured into that as well. And I talked about, this is what I've heard you say. And so here's where we're going to focus. Here's where I'm going to focus. Here's what we need, to do together. Here's, what there was so much in that, because this was an agency in transition. It was an agency that was 4 agencies brought together, and they were just starting to gel, and then everybody got sent home for COVID.
Wow.
And all of our business was still sitting in legacy pockets. So nobody was really, it was not dissimilar to Gyro, where you had media and creative who never got to work on projects together. So it was hard to create connection. You had 4 different businesses pushed together, and most of them there was no sharing of clients. So they weren't working with each other. So if you're not physically proximate in the office, you're actually not going to meet anybody but the people you work on your team with. So how do we change that? How do we create culture in a time of COVID? I was not, of course, the only person in the world trying to solve that, but there was an acute need for it. How do I establish your respect as your leader? How do I do that in a way where you can't see anything I'm doing, and I'm not going to just sort of tell you all of my accomplishments? So how do I earn your trust? How do I earn your respect? And not just the greater agency. How about my executive team? They're my partners. They've been running this agency for 6 months without me. Why the hell do they need me? So, there was a lot of trying to make sure to come in with an epic amount of humility, but also some, it goes back to, you have to have the confidence that you're there for a reason.
Because again, like these people in C-suite roles, you've never had a C-suite role, MD, and now you're CEO, effectively their boss. Yeah. And that's an interesting dynamic.
It is. And what I was lucky to have is, my boss was able to say to me, here's what I've seen working with your team while there hasn't been someone in your role. To give me some sense of where he saw the gaps. But he left room for me to come back and say, actually, I'm not sure I agree with you on that, but I agree with you on that. And this is how I'm going to. And I had to stop myself. I had a habit of sort of saying, well, because I'm new at this, or, I haven't been in media for a long time. And I found that I got told off quite a few times from various people who were like, you got the job, you need to stop qualifying it. And I said, that's fair, actually. Because it doesn't inspire confidence in anyone else, and it sure as hell doesn't make me feel good. And I think I thought I was doing it because it was, humble and the right thing to do. And in fact, it was just, it comes off like you're making an excuse. And the truth is, it doesn't matter, because everyone's put into you hope everyone ends up in their role for the right reason. And I'm a compliment to the people that were in role around me, as they are to me.
I think it's amazing how you took that approach in the seat to get the data, to then apply that and, really inform yourself, because that's not maybe an approach that everyone would have done. But by doing that, it gives you the best position and perspective to drive change that will affect all the people within the agency.
I think also you just, look, I always say it's because I'm a bit selfish, but I like to know everyone. And there's no way I was going to, actually wouldn't have known everyone if I hadn't have done that. If I'm going to stand up there after 3 months and tell you what I think we should do as an agency, I need you to see in whatever I'm showing you your thoughts, your input. The same way if I'm going to try to sell a creative idea to a client, or, a media, strategy, the worst thing I can do is go in and try to dictate something to you. But if I can build it on conversations we've had, or I can show you where your input has come into it, I am more likely to have a successful outcome. And running an agency is everything like that, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I want. The agency is the people who populate it. And so a dictatorship is useless in an agency, because it's not inspiring, and it doesn't make people want to work and to give you the benefit of their talent, which is what I sell every day, is their talent. So it has to be inclusive.
It reminds me of an account of a story of Kennedy when he was walking around one of the spaceports before they did the first mission to the moon, and he asked the janitor what he was doing, and the janitor said, well, I'm helping to put a man on the moon. And it's that when there's a vision there, everyone can get behind that and really, really be a part of something that's bigger than themselves. I guess it's the lesson there.
Absolutely. No, it's absolutely right.
So we're meeting for the first time in person today, but we did meet during quite early on in your career as CEO.
Yeah.
You came to our Unify sessions. It was all on Zoom at the time. How was that experience for you?
I mean, it was really cool for a lot of reasons. It was cool because, I remember the first one I joined. I mean, when we talked and you explained the mission, I thought it was really interesting. But then, joining one of the sessions, and I ended up in a breakout with my old pal, Sam Hockey. And
he was CEO at Saatchi at the time. And you'd been at
so
Saatchi.
we'd both gone on to do this job.
Was this time first time you'd both met while both being CEOs?
Yeah. And it, probably the first time we'd seen each other minus an awards show at some point where, and it was just really funny because, one, it reminds me how I've worked with some really cool people, and how quickly we fell right back into our old shorthand. But what I loved about those sessions was the number of people I got to connect with. I was so impressed from the beginning by the just the different array of really senior but very thoughtful and influential people that had chosen to be a part of it and to give their time. And even more so, what I loved was when we would have conversations and so we were all from competitive groups, right? Most of us in advertising work for one of 5 or 6 holding companies, which means we're inherently competitors. And to have, someone say, oh, you know what, we've got this framework, and then describe it and then say, I'll share it with all of you. And the open source sort of nature that we all felt like, especially because we were on topics of diversity and how to make our industry more inclusive. And so, and all of us agreeing this is not a place where we compete. This is a place where we open source and share and make it better for everyone. I loved that. I thought that was... I haven't seen it in the industry in a really long time. And as we started talking about other topics too, or you go off piece, but you'd be talking about pitching and how we all agreed that needs change, or just how are we taking care of our people? Because it was still COVID. So we were all trying to figure out how do we help people when you can't even be there to actually give them a hand? And, it's, pretty, for most of us who don't have a lot of time to do that or take the time to do that, the fact that so many did take that time and consistently come back, I felt really lucky I'd, answered your email when you emailed me on LinkedIn, I think, and because it really, it was a true oasis, I think.
Nice. Great to hear. And that's what it's about, Unify is about everybody coming together to create change, and that's when change can happen, in its best way, when all parties come together and go, okay, this is the challenge we're all facing.
Greater good.
It's a problem for all of us. Let's work on it and move it forward. And those sessions were about creating industry solutions. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in the change that you've made at Dentsu X. Now, I might be wrong in this, but you can tell me. In 2020, the company had 18 million in billings, according to the Nielsen report. In April 2022, the billings were reported for 2021 at 62 million. That's a 234% increase. You went from the you went up in the charts, let's say.
Wow. I don't think we went up that high. And I can't say that it's some specific change that I've made that's probably had that impact. I think, I would love that to be the true number. Although, again, to be fair, 2021 represented a significant rebound to the COVID times. And we have some clients who are certainly, were really impacted. We work with Heineken. And Heineken isn't just selling beer out of the grocery store. They own 2,500 pubs and bars in London,
Yeah, wow.
Which obviously were completely hit.
2,500 in the UK?
In the UK, not London.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, in the UK. So Star Pubs and Bars. And so they, spend, as you would expect, was significantly down. We work with Jaguar Land Rover. And, the car spend, the ability to go to a showroom was obviously also not there. And that was before the chip crisis that has continued to plague the car industry as a whole. But so some of our bigger clients certainly were impacted from a spend level, and would have rebounded significantly, probably not to a 240% increase, but certainly came back quite healthily. One of the things that we've worked really hard to do, so when we talked about what are the metrics that you want to keep a healthy business, we're very, very cognizant of our client satisfaction scores. And when we find that there are, areas that we need to focus on, we put a plan in place. We have an honest conversation about it, and we go after it because...
I've got a question. Does that, as any way, that experience of your role being completely focused on Toyota and then the client leaving, did that have any impact on like the importance of client satisfaction to retain business?
What it taught me is to read signals at all levels, because the interesting thing is we had an incredibly strong relationship at the day-to-day level, but the relationship wasn't as strong at the senior most levels. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of politics and gamesmanship in this world. And relationships matter as much as the commercials I put in front of you, as the level of work that we do, because it's a human business. And so relationships matter, and you got to read the signals. And I realize, like, it's funny when you're in a job like mine, people will tell you a lot. Like a lot of times they'll tell you what they think you want to hear, not what you need to hear. And, if I think I'm about to have a difficult conversation with someone and then it goes well, my first reaction is relief. And then my second reaction is, was that the honest? Like, did I get the honest, are they really okay? And so we have to become increasingly better at reading signals. Now, the benefit of tools like, we use the referral rating, which is a client satisfaction measure. Clients fill in a survey twice a year. It's really simple. And, everything from whether they don't fill it in, which can be a signal of, apathy, to they do fill it in and, they give you an okay score, but their comments suggest maybe something, or, the senior client gives you a great score, but the day-to-day, junior guy gives you a really bad score and says, working with you guys isn't very good. You can't assume because the senior client's happy that younger guy isn't going to go and make, eventually get heard, because actually, he's doing the work on his side. So I can't remember which person I worked with in the industry was talked about the right level of paranoia. So I think paranoia is also not particularly a fun emotion, but there's some sort of like positive paranoia, like just being like never just being assuming that it's okay, because you just got to keep your ear to the ground. You need to cultivate a team of client experts who know how to pick up on signals, have that right amount of paranoia that they're not constantly raising alarm bells, but, that just didn't feel right. All right, well, let's ask a question, and let's see if there is something to it.
Love
Great.
that.
Yeah.
Well, to summarize, we'll share what we learnt from your life.
Oh, boy.
And I think one thing that stuck out for me is at every stage in your career, from that first job where you got to meet Sports Illustrated and you're young, most people just say the right things and you just say what you think and you're your authentic self and you say it. To at every stage in your career, you seem to just go, look, hey, I'm new in production. I'm going to ask you lots of questions, but I won't ask twice. And you just stay your authentic self and you be honest about the situation, which seems like it helped you in your career rise up and get the MD role and get to CEO interview and go, look, that test was not for me, or these questions I've got issues with, or not issues with, but I think they could be evolved, or it doesn't show that my best self. But yeah, it's about being authentically you, and you've done that, and I think people really value that and respect it. And they don't want to know that you have all the answers all the time. They want to know that you're genuine and they can trust you. And I think that's something really people can learn from you and your life, if they want to progress in their life or career, to stay true to who they are and their values, and it's okay not to have the answers, is a great lesson.
Thank you.
Solidly put. I think if we can all have a little bit more Beth in our lives, then we can be able to live more honestly. If I was to distill a lot of what we've taken today, is one thing that really stuck out to me is when you said, did someone tell you what they needed to tell you or what they wanted you to hear? I think that's a really, really critical phrase and a critical way of thinking when you're relaying information to anyone. And to just be brave enough to say, look, you're probably not going to like the truth, but it's better I tell you the truth and than me give you, some kind of softened version that doesn't really tell you exactly what you need to know.
I think it's just always about understanding what is it going to take to get to the best place? And, how you say things really matters. But at the end of the day, I need to make it easy for people to be honest with me the same way I want them to make it easy for me to be honest with them. I'm not afraid to have a tough conversation, because if that's what's necessary, the difference is I don't go into it like it's a battle. I go into it knowing it's going to be more of a dance, I suppose. You're trying to get to an effective outcome is not about, well, for me anyway, it's not about aggression. I'm not in it to joust. This is not a competition. It's just always about kind of keeping your eye on what you want that outcome to be. And that's personal life, that's professional life. And it's about figuring out, it's those dials again. But yeah, I'm not particularly good at being anyone else but me. So it's a good thing that being authentically me seems to work. But I'm fairly certain that works for everyone. We all need to figure out how to turn ourselves up and down, right? Because the volume is a thing. But being authentic to you is going to be the most satisfying thing. You're not going to feel like you're living some kind of charade. It doesn't make you feel like you're sitting there having to put on a show, because that's exhausting. And I want to create a place where people, really feel like they're there because of who they are, not because of someone I think they are or they put on to be. And I do that because people have given me that opportunity all the way through my career. And that's the thing we always, I think, all have to go back and celebrate, is that most of us that do what we do are here on the shoulders, on the backs, hopefully shoulders, of people who have made way for us, or have taught us incredible lessons that made us, swerve and have pick the right path, or change something. I can remember so many of those very specifically. And I think if we all, and I have gratitude for them all. And I think that the more that we make sure to celebrate those things and talk about those things, because everything ends up being a narrative, right? This is a story. We've told a story today. We all have control over our narrative. We're all going to pick the things that make us sound the best. But at the end of the day, also, it's really important, because we have a microphone in front of us, or people who listen to us, to be really clear on there are times where things don't go well, or where we failed. And that failure is not a terrible word, no matter how much I hate it, or the idea of having to highlight my failures. But the fact of the matter is, you're here because you've failed and you've succeeded. So just us making room for people to have those experiences, and that's how they'll end up in this role. And it just continues, it's a virtuous circle.
And that, for those watching and listening, is how Beth Freedman became CEO of Dentsu X. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Cut.
Awesome.
We cut there.
Yeah. I hit that microphone about 30 times because I talk with my hands. I was like,
Everybody does. To be fair. Nobody hasn't, actually. Nobody hasn't yet.
Boom.
So I think we can help with that somehow. But yeah, great. There we go.
All right.
Done.